The greatest danger often lies not in the catastrophe we fear, but in the desperate measures we take to prevent it. We are told a chilling story, a tale of cycles and hubris, a narrative woven from the ghosts of 1929 and 2008, predicting an imminent financial apocalypse between 2025 and 2026. This story speaks of an everything bubble in American stocks, real estate, and bonds, a bubble so vast and precarious that its collapse is not a matter of speculation, but of mathematical certainty. It warns that the very tools used to save us before, interest rate cuts, money printing, government bailouts, are now exhausted, leaving us defenseless against a downturn that will dwarf all historical precedent. The indicators, we are told, are all flashing red. But what if this story, in its frantic effort to warn us of a repeating past, is blind to the unprecedented reality of the present? Welcome to US Financial Market Dynamics. We invite you to listen to the story and join us as we analyze and decode every specific detail. The narrative presented is a powerful one, built on a foundation of historical parallels and alarming data points. It argues that we stand on the precipice, driven by the same blind confidence that led our predecessors to ruin. The stock market, with valuations rivaling the peaks of 1929 and 2000, is portrayed as a house of cards, dangerously concentrated in a handful of tech giants. Real estate is deemed even more overvalued than it was before the Great Recession of 2008. And the bond market, the traditional safe harbor, is shown to be a sinking ship, weighed down by an unpayable mountain of government debt. The conclusion is stark. When everything crashes together, there will be nowhere to hide. But let us engage in a radical act of reverse thinking. What if the premise is fundamentally flawed? What if the actions of today are driven not by confidence, but by the deep, lingering trauma of past failures? The narrative of 1929 is one of inaction. When the crisis struck, the prevailing wisdom was to let the system purge itself. The Federal Reserve tightened policy, the government stood aside, and thousands of banks were allowed to fail, wiping out the life savings of millions. The lesson learned from that devastating decade was brutal and unforgettable. Deflationary collapse is the ultimate economic poison. Now, consider 28. Faced with a similar abyss, did policymakers repeat the mistakes of 1929? No, they did the exact opposite. They acted not with confidence, but with the terrified memory of the Great Depression guiding their hands. They unleashed trillions in bailouts, invented quantitative easing, and intervened on a scale previously unimaginable. They chose to fight the demon of deflation with the devil of inflation. The argument that we are now out of tools misunderstands the fundamental shift in economic philosophy. Those emergency tools of 2008 have become the permanent, foundational pillars of our modern financial system. The question is no longer if they will be used, but to what extent. The video points to the extreme interconnectedness of the global economy as a catastrophic weakness. But from a reverse perspective, this is precisely what makes a 1929-style collapse almost impossible. The system is no longer a collection of independent national economies. It is a single interwoven global organism. It has become, in essence, too big to fail. The collapse of the United States would not be an isolated event. It would trigger a global chain reaction that would bring down every major economy. China, Europe, Japan, none would be spared. Because of this mutually assured destruction, there is an implicit global pact to prevent such a catastrophic failure at all costs. Cooperation is no longer a choice. It is a survival imperative. The response to any systemic threat will not be to let it burn, but to flood it with liquidity from every central bank on the planet. Let's re-examine the so-called bubbles. The SRT file points to the S&P 500's high price-to-earnings ratio as evidence of irrational mania, akin to 1929. But what if these valuations are not irrational, but a logical consequence of the world's central banks have created? For over a decade, interest rates have been held near historic lows. Trillions of dollars have been injected into the system. In such an environment where cash and bonds yield next to nothing, capital has no choice but to flow into assets that offer a potential for growth. The extreme valuation of companies like Nvidia and the rest of the Magnificent Seven is not just AI hype. It's a reflection of a world starved for returns, where capital naturally concentrates in the few companies demonstrating real growth and profitability. They aren't so much a sign of a fragile market as they are the new blue chips in a low-growth, high-liquidity world. The concentration is not a bug. It is a feature of this new economic paradigm. Similarly, the housing market is described as being 43% larger than the 28 bubble. The comparison is meant to shock, but it ignores the fundamental differences. The 2008 crisis was built on a foundation of fraudulent and predatory lending. Ninja loans, no income, no job or assets, and adjustable rate mortgages sold to people who could never afford them. Today's market, while expensive, is built on a different foundation. The majority of homeowners are locked into low fixed-rate mortgages. Lending standards, while loosening, are nowhere near the reckless abandon of the mid-2000s. More importantly, the high prices are a direct result of a chronic, decade-long housing shortage. The crisis of 28 was a crisis of bad debt. The crisis of today is one of insufficient supply. While a price correction is certainly possible, a 2008-style collapse of cascading defaults is structurally far less likely. The problem in commercial real estate is more acute, particularly in office space. But this is more of a sectoral recession than a systemic threat. It will cause significant pain for regional banks, but it's a slow-motion problem that authorities see coming from a mile away. It will be managed, contained, and ring-fenced with targeted bailouts and extend and pretend accounting, precisely to prevent it from infecting the wider financial system. The third bubble, government debt, is presented as the final, unassailable proof of our doom. At over $36 trillion, it appears to be an insurmountable figure. The narrative suggests a fiscal doom loop, where rising interest payments force more borrowing, leading to a bond market revolt and default. But this view is based on the outdated concept of a household budget. Major sovereign nations with control over their own currency do not operate like households. They don't pay back their debt in the traditional sense. They service it and roll it over indefinitely. The United States, by virtue of issuing the world's reserve currency, has an exorbitant privilege that allows it to sustain debt levels that would cripple other nations. A true bond market revolt against us treasuries is unlikely, because what is the alternative? Every major currency is engaged in the same game of debt accumulation and monetary easing. A flight from the dollar would mean a flight to what? The euro, with its own structural problems? The yen, from a nation with an even higher debt to GDP ratio? The truth is, the massive debt is not the cause of the coming crisis. It is the resultancy of preventing the last one. It is the price we paid to avoid a second Great Depression in 2008 and again in 2020. The argument that the Federal Reserve has lost its tools is perhaps the most critical misunderstanding. The Fed is not trapped. It has simply made a choice. It has revealed its hand. When faced with the choice between a deflationary depression that wipes out the asset-holding class and causes immediate, widespread social unrest, and a long-term, managed inflation that slowly erodes the savings of the populace while keeping asset prices afloat, it will choose inflation every single time. Inflation is a subtle, less visible tax. It is a politically palatable way to devalue the mountain of debt and transfer wealth from savers to debtors, including the largest debtor of all, the government itself. Quantitative easing is not an emergency measure anymore. It is a standard policy tool. The balance sheet will never return to pre-2008 levels because it cannot. It has become a permanent feature of the market, a backstop that everyone knows exists. The real danger is not that the tools won't be used, but that their continuous use will have profound, long-term consequences. The warning signs cited in the original narrative, when viewed through this new lens, tell a different story. Warren Buffett hoarding cash is not just a sign that he expects a crash. It's a sign that in an environment of inflated asset prices and hidden inflationary risk, holding the liquidity of treasury bills offers a better risk-adjusted return than overpaying for equities. It's a defensive move against a future of low returns and high uncertainty. Insider selling by executives at top companies isn't necessarily a panic signal. It's often part of pre-scheduled trading plans and a logical diversification strategy when a huge portion of one's net worth is tied up in a single, high-flying stock. The inverted yield curve, the historically reliable recession predictor, is also behaving differently in this new era. In a world where central banks actively manipulate interest rates across the entire curve, its signaling power may be distorted. It may be signaling not an imminent crash, but a period of economic stagnation forced by the Fed's fight against the very inflation its policies created. So, if a 1929-style crash is not the real threat, what is? The climax of our story is not a sudden, violent explosion. It is a slow, dawning realization. The wealth will not vanish into thin air in a deflationary spiral. Instead, it will be systematically diluted and transferred through persistent, unending inflation that always runs hotter than the official statistics suggest. The true catastrophe is not a sudden heart attack like 1929. It is a chronic, degenerative disease. We will not have a Great Depression. We are entering a great stagnation, a period of low growth, high inflation, and financial repression, where the only way to preserve wealth is to take on ever-increasing levels of risk in the very bubble-like assets we are warned against. The system will not be allowed to collapse because the social and political consequences are too terrifying for those in power to contemplate. It will be propped up, bailed out, and injected with liquidity at every sign of weakness. The real crash is not in the markets, but in the purchasing power of money itself. The middle class will be hollowed out, not by unemployment, but by a cost of living that perpetually outpaces wage growth. Retirement will become an ever-receding dream for many, as savings that seem adequate on paper buy less and less in the real world. Young people will find it increasingly impossible to achieve traditional milestones like homeownership. The economy will be dominated by zombie companies, kept alive by cheap debt rather than innovation, leading to a decline in productivity and dynamism. The ultimate irony is that the very measures taken to save us from the abyss have locked us onto a path of slow, managed decay. The system has been saved. But the price is the long-term prosperity of the average citizen. In the end, the story we should be telling is not one of historical repetition, but of historical divergence. We are not in 1928, waiting for the inevitable crash. We are in a new, unprecedented era of perpetual intervention. The choice was made in 2008. We chose to sacrifice the future to save the present. We chose the slow erosion of inflation over the sharp pain of deflation. The question for us today is not how to prepare for the crash the video warns about, but how to navigate a world where the authorities will do anything and everything to prevent that crash from ever happening, and what that means for the value of our work, our savings, and our future. This video analyzes historical economic cycles and current indicators for educational purposes, not financial investment advice. Please consult a professional before making investment decisions. If you enjoyed listening to the story, please press like, share this video, and leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the US Financial Market Dynamics channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos.